amount of years, I actually don't think the value is that bad.
Here's the question, and this is a little bit of a retro Niner question, and you're a young guy, so this may not resonate with you. But an awful lot of talk this week about Frank Gore. And Frank Gore, it's funny. Would you have given Frank Gore a second contract? He had a 16-year NFL career. If you stayed strict
right?
to that, if you stayed strict to no second contracts for running backs, you would have probably gotten rid of Gore long, long ago with a lot of mileage left. But here's the question. Better 49er running back, Roger Craig, Frank Gore?
See, that's a tough question for me because I have no experience with Roger Craig. For me, it would have to be Frank Gore, and I don't know how up to date you are on Twitter, but I've been taking a lot of heat.
I've been seeing it. I'm seeing it here in the chat. Your Twitter heat is bleeding into the chat.
Yeah, well, what can I say? What can I say? I'm apparently the resident Frank Gore hater, but I would.
But you're taking Gore here over Craig.
I think I would take Gore. I think what Craig did in terms of individual achievement, I think his thousand season, especially at the time he did it, how unique it was to the rest of his contemporaries. I think it's more impressive than maybe any achievement of Gore's in an individual season. Right, Gore's 1,600-yard season was unbelievable, but it was also a year where Larry Johnson ran for 1,700 yards, and LaDainian Tomlinson ran for 1,800 yards, and Steven Jackson ran for 1,500 yards, and Edgerrin James ran for 1,400 yards. There were a lot of guys running for a lot of yards that season.
Yeah,
but there was nowhere near the 1,000 when Roger Craig did it. So from that standpoint, I think the individual achievement of that season is far greater than any individual achievement in any season for Gore. But I think you just got to look at the longevity and give Gore the edge. And I also think that where I kind of take away from Craig, and maybe this is just me being naive looking back at the Niners at that time, where I take away from Craig is that Craig was, the third or fourth guy that you talk about. You got to go Montana first. You talk about Bill Walsh first, then Montana. Then you talk about, Jerry Rice, of course, and you talk about then John Taylor because he fumbled in the was it the 90 championship game?
90 championship game. LT popped it out.
Right.
Dorsey, Eric Dorsey popped it out. LT jumped on it.
But in terms of Gore, right, in his prime with the Niners, 05 to 13, 05 to 14, the offense started with Frank Gore. I think Vernon Davis what became, a star player. Crabtree became, a star player for a season in 2012. Anquan Boldin had a really, really good season in 2013. But the conversation of the 49ers offense still started and ended with the run game, and it started with Frank Gore. So from that standpoint, I think I would give Frank Gore the edge. Maybe I'm being naive, and maybe Roger Craig was actually, the guy and the driving force on those offenses after Joe Montana and Jerry Rice, of course. But for me, if I look at it, obviously I watched Gore, did not watch Roger Craig. I would give Gore the edge.
I'm going Craig. And I know that would be like, what? How could you go Craig? Frank Gore is,
can you do me a favor? Can you tweet out, hey, I would take Roger Craig, and Roger Craig should be a Hall of Famer before Frank Gore. I just want to see the reaction.
Yeah, and I'm on the record of saying that. I believe in that. I saw the entirety of both of their careers. Frank Gore played in an era where the Niners didn't have a lot of other great weapons, and so they rode him. And the longevity of Gore is amazing. I mean, the guy tore 2 ACLs at Miami. He had never even played a down in the NFL, and then he went on to play 16 years, the last, 5 or 6 with no knee pads. I mean, even wear knee pads. Guy's wearing, ultimately, he's like running around in shorts out there. So I got nothing but respect for Frank Gore, and he really did hit the hole hard. And downhill runner, full cut speed, full speed cuts, I should say, and just a lot of the things
amazing
you want to see in a running back.
Amazing pad level, really
great
quick
body
feet.
lean.
Yeah,
but Roger Craig was a Pro Bowler at halfback and at fullback. And maybe the greatest Niner team was the 84 Niners. Roger Craig scored 3 touchdowns in the Super Bowl and maybe was the best player on the field in the 84 Super Bowl. So to me, Roger was a blocker. Frank was a great blocker as well. But Roger was a receiver. Frank was not the receiver that Roger was. And the 1,000, man, that's incredible. That's an incredible thing. So I'm going to say that Roger Craig doesn't fumble in the 90 NFC Championship game. He's probably already a Hall of Famer, and we're probably holding him in higher regard than we do currently. Because of that one fumble, he's not in the Hall of Fame, and he got put on Plan B free agency, didn't finish with the Niners. Anytime you bring up his name, somebody will bring up the fumble in the 90 NFC Championship game.
I mean, the first thing you brought up Roger Craig, and here are the comments: the fumble, the fumble.
He fumbled, and he cost us, and this and that. But Roger Craig was an incredible player. You could throw it to him in the flat, and he would make a huge play. And I think part of the reason that his individual numbers weren't greater is that he played alongside the most dominant statistical player in the history of the league, in Jerry Rice. And when as somebody who's big on numbers and analytics, there's only one football. So if you're playing with the most dominant statistical force the league's ever seen, almost by definition, your numbers are going to be somewhat, suppressed. And I think you can make that argument for Ricky Waters. You can make that argument for Brent Jones. You can make that argument for John Taylor. And you can make that argument for Roger Craig. They're all better than their numbers, their individual numbers, because they're all wearing jewelry, and the game plan was feed Jerry. And Jerry thrived on I think he was driven a little bit by insecurity and fear of losing his job. Shocking, because he was the best. Mm-hmm. But the Niners knew their players, and they knew what fueled him, and they knew that he needed the ball. Craig wanted the ball, but he wanted to win. Jerry needed the ball. And so I think they knew that. And so I think Roger Craig's numbers he's the guy whose individual numbers suffered the most by playing with the great Jerry Rice. And I just think that when you factor that in,
he was capable of having multiple thousand seasons.
No question. Okay. If he had been the only guy on that team, they would have fed him more. And it's like, I've been in the locker room after games. I can't tell you the number of times where the receivers had big days and the running backs didn't, or the running backs had a huge day and the receiver had 3 catches for 43 yards. It's very difficult to go into a post-game locker room and the starting running back goes for 120 and 2 touchdowns, and the star receiver goes for 120 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns. It's like, it's really, really rare. There's only one ball. So I'll say Roger Craig. I think and it's amazing because Gore has assembled what amounts to an undeniable Hall of Fame resume. But if you say when was Craig was the MVP, offensive player of the year in the league. Yeah. What year was Frank Gore
and
the best running back in the NFL?
That becomes a conversation for Frank Gore, right? And that's the conversation I brought up because criteria becomes confusing with all of this, right? Like, I never understand the criteria. Like, to me, I don't know why Rondé Barber is not in the Hall of Fame. And then if you want to go to, like, receivers, like, the receiving yard leaders, like, the entire top 10 is in the Hall of Fame, except besides Larry Fitzgerald, who's not been eligible. He will be eligible with Frank Gore. Funnily enough, Phillip Rivers will be eligible with Frank Gore, too. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But Torrey Holt, 6 straight 1,300-yard seasons. He's not in the Hall of Fame. Reggie Wayne is 10th. In all-time receiving yards. He has not made the Hall of Fame. Andre Johnson, who to me was the best receiver in the NFL for multiple seasons, is not in the Hall of Fame. So I'd never understand the criteria, and I think that's what becomes difficult. And I think with Gore, that's where the conversation is a little bit more difficult because over a career, it's difficult to touch Frank Gore because Frank Gore outlasted everybody in a position. And this is what I will say that I definitely overlooked when I was first talking about Frank Gore Hall of Fame is I overlooked the fact that the longevity at the running back position in particular, right? It's not just longevity in general, it's longevity at running back, which is ultimately unheard of and probably will not be replicated again in NFL history. So that part of it I did overlook. But if you're going, to a season by season basis of who you want for one game, who you want for one season, there's a lot of backs in Gore's era that you would take in front of Gore for one season, for one game. And it's a long list, right? You're going to take obviously LaDainian Tomlinson. You're going to obviously take Adrian Peterson. Then there's a guy like Jamal Lewis who ran for 2,000 yards. Then there's Priest Holmes who had a couple of really, really big seasons. Todd Gurley on an individual season or individual game, I don't know if I would take Gore over him. Zeke Elliott, when he first came out of college, all of that, in terms of, again, Gore, he cannot touch Gore's career. He's nowhere near Frank Gore. That's not what I'm saying. But if you're talking about on a one game, who do you want? Or one season, who you want? It becomes a conversation. And I think that's where with Frank Gore, it's a little bit more difficult to talk about that conversation, because usually when you're talking about the Hall of Famers, it's not just the longevity. You're talking about one game in their era. It's them or somebody else. And that's where I think Patrick Willis, I don't know why he's not a first ballot Hall of Famer, because yeah, he only played for 8 years, but for 7 of those, the best linebacker in the NFL was Patrick Willis and someone else. It was Patrick Willis and Curtis Lofton. It was Patrick Willis and John Beeson. It was Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman. It was Patrick Willis and Luke Kuechly. But it was always Patrick Willis, right? 8 years. That's a long time to be the best player at your position. That's unheard of in the NFL. And so because of that, I think the conversation becomes a little bit more complicated. I don't have any. What I say is irrelevant, really, because I have no bearing on whether Frank Gore gets in or doesn't get in, which is why I was so taken aback by the uprise, because my comments mean absolutely nothing. Like, at the end of the day, some voters will think Frank Gore's a Hall of Famer. Some voters will think he's not a Hall of Famer. I think he will eventually get in, given how the criteria has been for running backs in the past. Like, I think he definitely should get in, and he will. Or I don't know if he should. By my criteria,
he's
third
on the rushing list. He's going to get in,
and fifth in scrimmage yards, right?
Yeah, he's going to get in.
All-time numbers are amazing. His longevity is unheard of, but
and that matters.
It's just that prime, man. It's just that prime. Like, the fact that you couldn't look at, multiple seasons in Gore's career and say, damn, that season it was him, Adrian Peterson. They were the two best backs in football. Or you could
at their best. I mean, when Craig was at his best, I think his best was higher than Gore's best.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say and I'm not arguing that Gore doesn't belong.
Right? That's the point you're making, right?
And they're both Hall of Famers, in my opinion. They're both Hall of Famers. I'm not saying Frank doesn't belong. Frank belongs. I just think Roger belongs first. The last thought on this. You look at the all-decade team, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Every running back on the all-decade team for 3 decades is in the Hall of Fame, except Roger Craig. That's
messed up.
That's not right. And the 49ers as a dynasty should have greater Hall of Fame representation than they currently do. When you factor in they won 10 games or more for 16 straight years and have 5 Super Bowl titles in that window, that, to me, the 49ers need to be represented more. I also believe that
Larry,
if Bill Walsh were alive, he'd be arguing for
as a guy who covered him, right? Because, I mean, this is part of it is just, does the media like the guy, right? Like Terrell Owens, they screwed him over basically because they didn't like Terrell Owens, and that's
right.
That's an unfortunate human element to this conversation. You covered Roger Craig? Was he a jerk? Is it something where
one of the great guys there is? I mean, terrific guy. So a selfless guy, and here's the other thing that kills me too. And maybe this just bothers me, but Jerry Rice always gets credit for Craig's workout. It was Craig's workout, running that hill.
Really? The hill?
Craig was the one who ran that hill, and Jerry's the one who made it famous.
I had no idea about that.